What's up, everybody? Welcome into DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com, part of the Medium Large Sports Network. My name is Jeff Spiegel, joined today by special guest Farhan Zaidi, who is now a special advisor to the Dodgers. He was formerly the general manager of the Dodgers, the president of the San Francisco Giants, among other things. Farhan, thank you so much for your time, your generosity, and for joining us today.
That's great to be here, Jeff. Thank you.
Farhan was kind enough. We met at spring training. He was kind enough to agree to come on the show. And so I'd love, I told you right before hopping on, I'd love to hear a bit about your story because it's unique in the baseball world in some ways and ununique in other ways. And then pick your brain about some of the baseball stuff. I think you're one of the smartest guys out there. And I don't just say that because you're working for the Dodgers, but let's start with kind of your background a little bit. You were born in Canada. You grow up in the Philippines. Now you're working in Major League Baseball. Help me connect a couple dots there.
Yeah, there's a few dots there to connect. I mean, it's interesting. I was talking to somebody about this the other day. I first got into baseball partly because one of my mom's friends had suggested to her that she sign me and my brothers up for t-ball as a way to like get rid of us for a couple hours a week. She had four kids and trying to keep them busy. So that's how I started playing baseball, and then I just really developed a passion for it. And growing up in the Philippines, it almost created more of a passion for it because it was so difficult to get box scores to watch games. So, anytime there was a game on TV or anytime I got my hands on a baseball book, it was something so special. So, then coming over here for college, after having grown up in the Philippines, played baseball, been here during the summers. I continued to follow the sport very closely, and I sort of went through the early part of my career, graduating from college, working in management consulting. I always sort of had the dream, of maybe I'd have the opportunity to get into baseball at some point. While I was in grad school is when the book Moneyball came out, and somebody recommended to me that I read it. And obviously, I was like so many people for so many different reasons, really captivated by the book. But for me, the main theme of it was opportunity, reading about Paul DePodesta and David Forrest. I mean, David, I got to give him credit. He had a great baseball career at Harvard, so, a D1 school, so much more of a baseball player than I was. But just the way Billy thought about populating his front office with people who are passionate about the sport, but maybe didn't necessarily have professional playing careers, it just made me think, oh, maybe I'll have a shot. And sure enough, in late 2004, the A's put up a job listing for an assistant in their front office. They later told me they got over 1,000 applicants, and I just got really lucky that I got in the door for an interview and really hit it off for those guys. So a lot of really good luck and good fortune. And 20 years later, the fact that I'm still in baseball, it's really a blessing, and I've really enjoyed every step along the way.
I love it. Well, you get your undergrad from MIT. You're in the Bay Area getting your PhD from Berkeley. I'm curious, when you read Moneyball, did you believe, like somebody who thought the way that you thought and was obsessed with the things you were obsessed with outside of just the sport of baseball? Prior to Moneyball, was there a belief among folks like that there was a place for them in baseball?
Yeah, it's funny kind of diving deeper into it. One of the first books, baseball books that I got my hands on in the Philippines was the Bill James Handbook in 1985. So very early on, maybe just by chance, I viewed the game through a very analytical lens, partly because those Bill James abstracts were some of the few baseball books that made their way to the Philippines. So, when somebody first mentioned Moneyball to me, I thought, what's this story about this guy reinventing baseball and analytics? I mean, this stuff's been out there for decades, and Bill James has been writing about this stuff. So, kind of ironically enough, my first reaction was kind of resistance. Like, this stuff's already out there. I don't need to read a book about this. Um, but then again, I think reading it, it was more about, the opportunity, the inner workings of the front office, and the feeling like it was accessible. And to this day, Billy, he does the speaking circuit. He talks a lot about baseball, but also about, how he went about putting together his front office. And just the fact that he believes in a meritocracy. He believes that if you work hard and you're passionate and there's a job that you want and you're qualified, that's all it should really take. So I owe my entire career to him having that philosophy. And that spread in baseball and even among other sports now, I think you see more people getting involved in front offices that maybe didn't have playing careers. And I think it's been great for sports because it's just brings different perspectives to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved. I was reading Andy McCullough did a piece on you. I think when you were first with the Dodgers, and he found the nugget that first job, a guy with a PhD from Berkeley was making $32,000 a year. I mean, there's no doubt. I read that. I said, look, nobody can accuse this guy of not loving baseball if he said yes to that job.
Yeah, I don't know if Andy mentioned in the story, but I was so scared to tell my parents about my the job and definitely about the salary. Just because, I'd been in undergrad, they put me through college. I was making kind of six figures after a couple of years in management consulting. Then I went back to grad school. I'm in grad school for 3, 4, 5 years, and they're like, "There's got to be a payoff here somewhere." And
Totally.
instead, I took quite a step backwards. But I really underestimated my parents. I'm a little embarrassed about it to this day because they were so happy for me. They were so excited. They didn't even ask me, thankfully, how much I'd be making. And they've been so supportive of me every step of the way. So again, I think it's really reassuring story about, people supporting folks who are following their passions.
I love it. I love it. Well, in 2014, you make your way to the Dodgers, and I won't dig into. I know there's a big piece of this, the decision of making. Do I leave the A's and the loyalty that you had for that place? But really, I want to focus on you go from an organization in the A's that had no choice but to focus on inefficiencies and had no
Right.
choice but to sort of find hidden gems. And then you go to the Dodgers, who with Andrew Friedman were obsessed about those same things and yet also kind of had the resources to do both. So, what was the biggest surprise if you can take yourself back 10 years to coming to LA? What was the biggest surprise about how the Dodgers operated from going from the outside to the inside?
Yeah, I think, once the season got underway and, we got to see the inner workings and operations of Dodger Stadium on a day in, day out basis. Now having been with a third organization, I can say, the scope of the operation, in LA is pretty much unlike, anything with any other team in baseball. It's so impressive. It's so well run. And so I think the scale of it for some of us coming from other organizations was a little bit eye opening. That first offseason, Andrew and I kind of reminisce about it and joke about it all the time. I mean, the volume of moves that we made, and trading away really established, beloved players, um, with the Dodgers, bringing in some younger, less proven players. Our notion of just creating depth in the organization and flexibility, and some of the things that in smaller markets we really valued. We kind of laugh about it now because there was like an audacity to what we were doing that I don't
Yeah.
think we totally realized at the time. So, great Dodger players like Matt Kemp and D. Gordon, guys that we moved on from because we were looking to put together a different type of roster. I'm not sure you would ever see the same thing today with somebody coming in and taking over a team. So I think in a way, that first offseason over the first few years, we brought some of the small market mentality in terms of creating a little bit more of an efficient, deeper operation. And then honestly, it was after I left in large part, when you started layering on guys like Mookie and Freddie and Shohei, obviously. And so now you really have the best of both worlds. It's been really impressive what Andrew and his crew have done the last few years.
Last question about your story before we get into just baseball stuff. 2018, you moved to San Francisco, which I was very pissed about because I was like, they're not allowed to have smart people up there. Just send them people that aren't good at their jobs, not people that are good at their jobs. But as I was preparing for this, I was thinking about your experience in baseball front offices and how unique it is because you start with the A's, who I would say are the poster child for again having to mind the inefficiencies and not having a choice. Then you go to the Dodgers, who have the choice to not worry about minding the inefficiencies in some ways, but they decide they're going to do it anyways and outspend everybody. But then you go to San Francisco, who to some degree has money. They're a larger market team. They're willing to spend. And yet then you're in a place where it's not necessarily quite as shiny or quite as attractive. And whereas the Dodgers kind of in some ways get who they want to get, then you were in a place where you had money, but you couldn't always get the guys you wanted. What was that experience like contrasted with the A's and the Dodgers?
Yeah, I guess I would add to that. when I first arrived in San Francisco, it was really an organization in transition. It was an older roster. It was a really expensive roster, and there wasn't much of an appetite to rebuild.
Mm,
It's a big market where people expect the team to be competitive every year. So those first couple of years, it was really, and I use the phrase a lot, like we can't out Dodger the Dodgers, right? So we've got to go about this in a different way. And that meant being really resourceful with the roster, engaging in some maybe less conventional strategies, and really having the mindset that the whole's got to be greater than the sum of the parts until we can build up the farm system, until we can sign some star players. And actually, we had some success with that. Obviously, 2021 was a sort of hallmark year for the Giants. And again, ironically enough, I think the challenge came in the transition phase of, well, now we've sort of built up the depth of this organization. We can go sign some star players to really um, headline the roster because we have the depth behind them to be a competitive team. And as you kind of alluded to, that was a little bit of a challenge in San Francisco. I have spent most of my adult life in the Bay Area. I love the Bay Area, and I want to make that very clear. And anything I said or any challenges we had, are totally separate from that. But again, I guess there's this popular notion that, oh, players may not want to play in San Francisco. I really don't think it was that. I mean, again, when you look back at some of our highest sort of profile pursuits, it was Bryce Harper, it was Shohei, it was Aaron Judge. I mean, these are like top 5 players in all of baseball who had really compelling reasons to sign somewhere else. And when I look back on it, I think we made really good pitches to those players. But the consolation prize of finishing in second place is just that you don't get the player. So,
yeah.
so that was a little bit of a challenge. I think they did a really nice job this offseason bringing in Willie Adames, who plugs what was the biggest hole in the roster. But I think some of that transition from, hey, let's build up the roster, let's create the depth like we did in LA the first few years, and then transitioning to the like now we can go out and take some big swings. It was a little bit more challenging in San Francisco.
Yeah, I'm sure you've been asked about this 100 times, and you just mentioned it, so I want to ask. Like, there was the Aaron Judge pursuit, and then there's the famous tweet that gets sent out that Arson Judge is headed to the Giants. For the Dodgers, we know what that feels like in the midst of the Shohei Ohtani pursuit as
Right.
well. From your side, like when that comes out, obviously you're like, well, we don't know that this is happening. I mean, what was that experience like?
It was really infuriating, actually, and I have a good relationship with John Heyman, and we've joked about it since then. But at the time, it was really infuriating. That's the only word that I can think of because honestly, I we recognized the pull for Aaron of going back to New York. I mean, the Yankees are one of the greatest franchises in the sport, and that was always going to be there. And the only way that I thought we had a chance to land Aaron was to lay low, and just be around the backboard if he decided he was looking for a change, if he decided the financial terms that we were offering were attractive enough to do it. Um, so this tweet going out, I mean, and the Yankee people have talked about it since, it scared the life out of them. And
Mm,
I think that's part of what precipitated them stepping up financially, matching the area that we were in, and ultimately getting the deal done. So I guess for me, it's a little bit of a what if, what if they hadn't been spooked that way? Because again, I have a lot of respect for that organization. I think they got to a point where they said, "Hey, this is all we're going to do, and you can tell us whenever you want, but this is where we are." And I actually think that tweet maybe, and they've said this themselves, kind of propelled them to take that last step to get a deal done. So yeah, one of the great what ifs, at least for me, is what if that tweet never got sent out? Would our sort of lay low strategy have paid off? And obviously, there's no way to know.
yeah. So this offseason, you come back to the Dodgers. You had plenty of opportunities, I'm sure, of other places to go. And yet it seems like, you're not the first, nor will you be the last person who gets an opportunity elsewhere and then ends up coming back to Los Angeles. What is it about the Dodgers for somebody like you? And I know you have, it sounds like, some opportunities that don't just include the Dodgers as far as your relationship with the ownership. But what is it about the Dodgers that keeps folks like you coming back to honestly to positions that you could probably get more influence, more power, so to speak, elsewhere?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I was fortunate enough to get a few calls from teams around the league. And again, it's sometimes I shake my head at the fact that I've been doing this for 20 years now. It felt like I just started myself.
Yeah.
So, the relationship with Andrew, with Brandon Gomes, Stan Kasten, the group of people with the Dodgers, it's sort of, and I think even players might say this. I was only in LA for 4 years. It felt a lot longer than that. And coming back, it feels like a place that I spent a lot of time. So again, I think that's a credit to the culture of the organization. To me, it was not, hey, let me come back to this juggernaut, because to your point, what kind of influence impact can you have to a team that's so well run already? I mean, I've joked with people that coming back to the Dodgers organization, it's like when you were a kid and your parents took you to an expensive department store and they're like, don't touch anything, don't break anything. And so that's sort of how it's been for me. But um, I think it's a combination of the relationships, maybe getting to step back and think about some bigger picture questions that in the day-to-day grind, running an organization, you don't always have the time to think about those things. So that's a fun intellectual challenge. And then on top of that, like you mentioned, having a relationship with the ownership group, some of the different sports that they're talking about getting into that they're already involved in, and a chance to help and support the efforts there. That was sort of a different wrinkle with the Dodgers that I was pretty excited about.
Love it. Well, you mentioned big picture stuff. That's where I wanted to go next. You talked about how analytics have been around since, for 40 plus years, right? And then Moneyball comes out. And I love that your response was, guys, this stuff has been happening the whole time.
Right.
And I'm sure there are people nowadays who are like, hey, guys, Moneyball happened, 20 years ago. Like, why are we still talking about some of this stuff? And yet there are teams that, from analytics, statistics, whatever metric you want to use, maybe aren't fully up to speed, but it feels like more and more and more teams are heading in that direction, chasing after inefficiencies, chasing after, certain pitches, certain skills, certain tools, whatever it might be. So I guess my weird big picture question I wanted to ask you is there a world where like all of the inefficiencies eventually get gobbled up in the sport of baseball and teams that are smarter, it no longer matters if you're smarter because everybody's on the same playing field?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the most interesting things in this realm of analytics and the way front offices work now is you're starting to get a group of players sort of retiring and moving on to working in front offices now who kind of came up and played during this analytics
Hmm.
generation, So I think with the Dodgers, on the pitching side, guys like Chris Archer and Tyson Ross. I mean, players that I, had relationships with. I was with Tyson in Oakland and briefly in LA. Chris is a guy I talked about signing a couple of times and had a little bit of a personal relationship with him. The fact that these guys are now working in the front offices, and again, it's not new that players are in front offices, of course, former players, but that they went through the experience of, analytics really coming into the sport, how it may have influenced their development, how it influenced how they pitched. And now they can really relate to other players in terms of how they interpret these numbers, and how we sort of deploy and implement an analytical mindset in the organization. So that I think is a little bit of the frontier right now. We continue to push and develop more sophisticated tools, but the implementation, particularly in the minor leagues, having players that went through the experience and can really relate to how players think about these things, how they can take those numbers from the spreadsheet and onto the field to sort of optimize performance. That's one of the most interesting areas. And again, I think this is a credit to Andrew and Gomer, the culture and environment that they've created. A lot of these players are excited to come work for the Dodgers because of the organization that's been built. And, Chris and Tyson are just two examples of that.
One particular thing I wanted to ask about, maybe specifically, but also just as maybe an example. When I was looking at the guys that the Dodgers went out and signed this offseason, which I know, you were kind of in transition moving to LA, but they go out and get a guy in Blake Snell and Tanner Scott, two of the biggest names that they signed. Obviously,
Hmm.
there were other big names they signed. But when I looked at their profile, it was two guys who walked a lot of batters. And I'm not nearly as smart. I'll never pretend to be as smart as folks like you. Walks were always the worst thing a pitchers could do. Like it was always don't walk anybody, don't walk anybody, don't walk anybody. And here you have one of the five-ish best starting pitchers in baseball, and maybe the best relief pitcher in all of baseball, and they walk a lot of guys. Is that the movement where maybe walks are okay because we get a lot of swing and miss, and a walk is better than a double and soft contact and all that? Like, is is this something that is changing in the way that people think about the sport, where walks used to be bad and now they're good? Or is maybe some of the general public, folks like myself, just catching up with something that folks like you have known for 5, 10, 15 years?
Yeah, I think all things being equal, you'd rather have a guy who throws strikes than a guy who walks players. Those two guys in particular are so exceptional at, you know, keeping players from hits and certainly from keeping players from damage that the overall profile still puts them in the elite category. And again, I don't think those things are totally independent. I think part of what makes them so difficult to hit, uh, and this is particularly true of Blake, who I know a little bit better from spending time with him in San Francisco last year, is they just don't give hitters a lot of pitches to hit,
Yeah.
and intentionally are sort of working around the zone and keeping pitches out of the middle of the zone. I remember the first bullpen I thought I saw Blake Snell throw in San Francisco after we signed him. I was shocked by the precision of his bullpen because he has this reputation as a pitcher who, walks a lot of guys, but he was just absolutely dotting. He looked like a pitcher with 70 command. And I think that also speaks to what happens when you go from 90 or 95% effort to 100% effort. Maybe you lose a little bit of that. But when you talk to Blake, who's really smart about pitching, um, he will say, I can always get the next guy and I'm not going to give in. And
Yeah.
even last night, the start he had, it wasn't his best, but he did a good job keeping runs off the board. And part of it was, he's throwing like 3-0 changeups. He's like, I'm not giving in and
Yeah.
giving up the 3-run homer. And so I think it's a really good point that you make. And maybe in some ways we're getting a little bit too far away from the meat and potatoes of analytics, which is like dominate the strike zone, whether you're a hitter or position play, or pitcher. But I think cases like that, guys that really limit contact and certainly damage, you can live with the walks because they wind up just stranding a lot of those guys because of the pure stuff they have.
Yeah, it's funny when we did our post game show, we were talking. People were already like, "Man, it's so many walks," and we're like, "This is it's not the perfect Blake Snell experience, but I'm just learning a ton about pitching from him because you said, I mean, these are sort of the quote or newer stats, but somebody had like a meatball stat where it's like how many pitches does a guy throw right down the middle, and Blake Snell throws less than anybody in baseball. He lives on the edges. If I walk guys, fine. If they ever hit anything out there, it's going to be weak and we're going to be fine. And so it was 4 walks, but it was 2 earned runs, and the Dodgers beat Tarek Skubal. And it's like, what more could you possibly want in a game like that?
Right. And I think I watched the game carefully, yeah, yesterday, and I was particularly interested in how Blake would do. His stuff is pretty good. You're seeing the velocity, but he's not where he was sort of late last year down the stretch. I think he would even say
Sure.
that himself. So there's a lot more to come with him. And again, I think something to feel good about is he's obviously way ahead of where he was last year when we signed him late and he got off to a slow start and wound up getting hurt. I think this year he's always been a little bit of a slow starter, so I think you'd see some buildup even with the full camp like he had this year. And again, if you're getting performances like this early and you know there's a lot more in the tank, I think there's a good amount to be excited about.
Last question for you, then we'll let you go. On the front office side, I think about the number of contingencies that an organization like the Dodgers must have. I mean, you look at the depth they have in starting pitching, you look at the depth they have in the bullpen, but you also look at how many of these guys have options. You guys talk a lot about flexibility. Probably for the first time that I can remember in a while, the Dodgers have a lot of pitching that does not actually have a ton of flexibility as far as who can be sent down and who can be moved here and there. I'm not asking for specifics, obviously, but can you just take us a bit into like how many contingency plans do you guys have for, okay, if 2 months from now, if these 6 guys are all healthy, what are we going to do? Or if these bullpen arms are all healthy and we can't send anybody down and we only get 14 pitching spots because Shohei is Shohei, like how do front offices navigate stuff like that?
Yeah, I'm not involved in the sort of day to day of what the pitching staff is going to look like every day. Although, to your point, it might look different every day, especially as you kind of get into the season and using the 6-man rotation and making sure Roki in particular is getting rest. That's going to require a lot more active management. To your point, the 12th and 13th spots on the pitching staff are probably guys that need to be optionable, where you can cycle in fresh arms as needed. So there's a lot of thought that goes into that. There's sort of a spreadsheet that has every pitching change that you might make on the roster for the next month. And that's what you should want. And obviously, Doc, Mark Pryor, the coaching staff is really involved in that. The people in player development are involved in that. I think everybody understands that because of the construction of the pitching staff this year, because of the need to get guys extra into rest and maybe not go with a traditional 5-man rotation, it's going to require some flexibility both on the roster and in terms of players understanding that there's going to be a little bit of back and forth. So I know a lot of thoughts gone into it, and to your point, there's a lot of quality pitching, which is a good problem to have. When some of these guys come back and maybe the organization is faced with some difficult decisions, honestly, I think the plan right now is we'll deal with that when we get there. It's a good problem to have. And a lot of times these things will work themselves out. So I'm probably giving the company line that you've heard from other folks. But again, I think it's a really good plan in the short term to make sure that guys are rested, that you're being really careful with guys, because particularly early in the year, that's critically important.
I love it. I love it. I said that was the last question. I meant to ask, are you allowed back in the fantasy football league now that you're back with the Dodgers, or are there some guys that aren't too happy about you coming back?
That's a good question. I mean, there's a handful of guys who are still around, and there's some kind of raised eyebrows when I walk by, and partly because of that specific reason is, are we going to let this guy back in? So I think there'll be some behind the scenes discussions on that. They've got a few months to decide whether they're going to let their guard down or keep the walls up. So that remains to be seen.
Yeah, I think you need to go around the locker room and say, hey, whoever's the highest bidder, I'll come in and I'll help co-manage a team here and there, and guarantee championships.
I might have to, some of the old guard that were around when I was there, I might have to start sending them some fruit baskets and things like that to soften them up for that eventual vote.
I love it. I love it. Well, that is Farhan Zaidi again, the a special advisor to the Dodgers and other stuff that Dodgers owners are involved with. Farhan, we appreciate your time. Best of luck this season, and hopefully we'll be able to chat again.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. It was fun.
Everybody, thanks for watching again. This is DodgerHeads presented by DodgerBlue.com, part of the Medium Large Sports Network. Enjoy the rest of your day. As always, go Dodgers.